So in this last workshop, I would like to talk to you about how we can now transfer mesh information from Blender into Alias, and in between use Maya for the mesh to NURBS conversion. However, before I go more into detail about how to use Maya, I think we should talk about two specific problems when you transfer 3D data between programs, and that can be the scale and orientation issue. Some programs, for example, define what's a side view and a front view differently, and also the scale between units can sometimes have some minor hiccups. So it's always good to pre-check your workflow and figure out what might have to be adjusted so you don't have any surprises down the road. So here in Blender, I'm going to actually set my work environment, my units, to metric, and then I'm going to add a cube. You see this cube is 2 meters by 2 meters by 2 meters, and I'm going to extrude on top a face out just to make sure that visually I can see where, for example, the up vector is, and I'm going to move another face out at the side by 3 meters. And I'm inside front view, so I would like this object to come in also the same way into Alias, so when I'm inside the front view in Alias, I will see that object that way. Now I have to export this mesh, and I have it selected, so I could go to File, Export, and then export as wavefront OBJ. That is the polygon format Alias itself developed for Maya and Alias. And it's also in general a very widely utilized polygon mesh format. Then on the left side, I'm going to my desktop. I turn on selection only. Those I turn off. And then down here I have scale, forward and up. So I know by experience that here I have to put in a scale factor of 100 so that my polygon mesh, when I bring it into Alias, is scaled up by 100. And a 2 meter cube in Blender is then also a 2 meter cube in Alias. And I know this number because I just tried to bring it in and see how Alias is treating my mesh, and I noticed that Alias is scaling the thing down. So for example, I call this one 2 meter cube. And then, well, I have to figure out what is up and what's forward. You see that, for example, here it says the up vector should be Y, but I want this to be Z. And forward should be X, because X here, that is my side view, or sorry, front view. So that should be forward. And I go back to here. Okay, I have to turn this on again because I didn't really sign off on it. So this should be forward X, up is Z, and then 2 meter cube dot obj. On my desktop, I click export, and then I go into Alias. And the first thing, of course, what you have to make sure is, are you using the correct dimensions? So right now this is set to feet, so I have to set this one to meters for the main unit, and then maybe centimeters for the smaller units. And in case you work with metric, imperial, then of course it's feet and inch, but I work with metric. And I have to reset my construction plane as well. So I'm changing the grid. So I would maybe a grid spacing be let's say 2 meters, 2 subdivisions. Yeah, that is okay. So I click go. And if I zoom out a little bit, then I could go to File, Import, File. And then on my desktop, here you see my cube. I can't select it. It's kind of grayed out because under Show, I have to set this one to all. And then 2 meter cube is still grayed out, but actually now I can click it. Then click Open. And that brings the object in. Now let's go into a top view and set this one to orthographic and zoom in. And there you see that actually this imported mesh fits perfectly into my grid. Maybe let's try to make a check. So I create a key point curve, and this line, as you can see, is 2 meters long. So that's perfect. At least the scale is correct. But let's go into a front view and let's zoom out. And we see also in the front view, my object is positioned correctly. So in front view here, I see my object this way, and in Blender in front view, I see it this way. So that's why it's very important to set the scale X and Y all correctly. And you also notice that my object is perfectly centered in the world view. And in Alias, it is exactly the same. If I go into perspective, you see here, let me go and select my object. There is the pivot point, and it's at X, Y, and Z, 0. So now that's in Blender the object center point, and in Alias the pivot point. And here it's the same as well. So if, for example, I move this one, let's say 2 meters along the y-axis, and let's export this one again. Export, and let's go into Alias, File, Import, and I just import this file again. There you can see now that the other object, this one, got moved 2 meters to the right. But you notice that when you bring it in, there is still the object center point down there. So this one, when you does not stay like from Blender, whenever you export mesh into a different format, all objects will get their object center point, or in Alias a pivot point, set to X, Y, and Z 0. So you see all those two objects have the same pivot point. So keep that actually in mind. You also, in general, don't want to necessarily move those parts a lot around, because let's say in one point I need to change something in Alias, but I would like to change this now in Blender. I could easily go ahead and say, well, okay, this is maybe not the way I want. It has to be angled. I could go ahead, export wavefront, export it again, go into Alias, and then re-import the object. And you see this object is inserted exactly where the other one is. So this I can delete. So in Alias, you don't want then to move those around, because when you re-import something, when you change something in Blender, you would have to reposition it, and that is just prone to inaccuracies or misplacements. So this covers basically how you bring basically a polygon mesh into Alias, and how to take care of the scaling and orientation. And in case you work with Imperial in Blender, it's also the same scaling factor. So also for Imperial, you just have to set the scale factor to 100.